All right, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on wherever you're joining us. My name is Omar Sadr, and I'm a research scholar at the Center for Governance and Markets, University of Pittsburgh. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you and our speaker, Saeed Madadi, to today's webinar titled Dysfunctional Centralization, Growing Fragility Under the Taliban Rule. Saeed Madadi is a Reagan Democracy Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum for Democratic Studies, and a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies program. He has written recently a piece at the Middle East Institute, which is titled the same as today's talk, Dysfunctional Centralization and Growing Fragility Under the Taliban Rule. As you all know, 1 year ago on August 13th, international community and international troops left Afghanistan. Since then, the situation of the country has only grown more fragile, marked by deterioration of living conditions, widespread human rights violations, increasing political instability. Madadi argues that one key contributing factor to the crisis is a dysfunctional centralized governance structure that has come more paralyzed and unresponsive under the Taliban control. In past 20 years, increasing literature has been addressing the same thing. However, this literature and policy analysis has not been translated into practical policies. By default, the Taliban as a totalitarian regime, of course, favors a centralized model of governance, and they have been using and utilizing the previous republic's structure to a large extent. That's what Madadi argues. Without further ado, I think I will allow Saeed Madadi. He will speak for roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will open up the session for question and answer. Madadi, it's yours now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Umar. It's so good to be with you, thanks for having me for this event at the Center for Governance and Markets. I follow the incredible work that you guys are doing there. So just to jump right at it, the paper, as you mentioned, discusses the implications of a heavily centralized political structure on fragility and resilience. Basically, for the past year, after last August, when the Taliban came to power, so many alarms went off. The poverty is increasing, that people do not have anything to eat. There's a drought coming. And there were other issues that came with the shift in the political sphere, which was the liquidity crisis, for example, that came with the Taliban's precarious relationship with the rest of the world, and the withdrawal of international forces and all of the money and resources that was in the country with them. My argument in the paper is that the Taliban's return to power was a huge factor in how we're seeing the country struggling with all of these political and economic challenges. But the root cause of these challenges were there before. And one of those factors, if not the only or the biggest one of the key ones was the centralization of political power and economic planning in Kabul. Because if you see, Kabul has never been historically a hugely metropolitan and rich city. In recent decades, it has been, but it's not remotely comparable to Balkh, for example, to Herat, for example, or elsewhere. Kabul becomes Kabul after 1880, when the modern Afghanistan is created through a very heavily centralized system. The economic planning is based in Kabul. The political power is concentrated in Kabul. So if you were rich in the periphery, you would come to Kabul. But if you wanted to get rich, you would also come to Kabul, because that was where the money was, and that was where the decision-making about the money was. So over time, basically Kabul grew at the cost of the rest of the country. all of the human resources came to Kabul. The best and the brightest of the country had to come to Kabul for education, for job opportunities, and most of them never went back to their provinces. Economic resources came to Kabul over and over again, so the main businesses were based in Kabul. If you see on August 15th, and the implications of those political events and the economic situation of the country, part of that is because in some sense, there was no economy out of Kabul to speak about. So when Kabul collapsed, everything out of Kabul was an extension of the economic sphere that we had created in Kabul. So when Kabul collapsed, it was almost like you just untie the very top knot of a picnic tent, so everything else will fall apart. The economy in the provinces were either the public service, which was centralized in Kabul. So when Kabul collapsed, there was no public administration out of Kabul to recruit people, to pay people, or it was most of the service economy were the NGOs who were receiving money from the donor community, and all of them were based in Kabul. So when they left, there was the job market collapsed out of across the country. It's a tricky environment because if you were out of Kabul, a province like Herat, for example, or Balkh, for example, and you had the capacity to raise resources to generate revenue, and that revenue was coming to Kabul, the more efficient and effective you were in raising those revenues over the years meant that the poorer you made yourself, because you gathered a lot of resources and you sent it to Kabul, and the Kabul had no commitment and a lot of times even no political will to necessarily invest that revenue in your well-being, in your infrastructure, for example. So the more revenue you generated, the worse off you would be in the future, because you had no means of investing that revenue in terms of capacity building for yourself. An interesting example is Herat in the first years after 2001, when Governor Ismail Khan, for example, refuses to send his revenue to Kabul. If you go to Herat city has two main characteristics, or at least two main infrastructure resources that no other city in the country has. It has a very good road system around the city, very wide, large, high quality roads. And it's the only city in Afghanistan that has a centralized canalization system, a sewer system. And both of these were built during those first years after 2001, when the province was investing its own resources. After that, no infrastructure project of that scale or that quality has been undertaken anywhere in the country, because the decision-making in Kabul was not willing to put money into that sort of resources. So the country out of Kabul had no means of coping with economic and recently even environmental shocks. Because if you see the reports from the United Nations Development Program, if you see the reports from the World Bank and other observers, alarms have been raised, concerns have been raised about the growingly worrisome economic conditions and environmental conditions across the country for several years. Afghanistan's Minister of Finance, for example, for over the years were part of a lot of these conversations. But in order to do the smallest thing about those issues, you had to get the approval of Kabul, and the Kabul was busy doing other things that were its own priorities and not necessarily the priorities of the people who were in the periphery. That picture becomes much more clear if you see the political aspects of things after August 15th, 2021. As people were struggling, the regime was also busy consolidating its grip on power. If you remember, in the first weeks after August 15th, there were news organizations who were much more openly functional. Women were on TV interviewing Taliban members, for example. But the more time passed, the more brutal the regime got. It's cracked down on media, on civil society, on any voice of dissent became bigger and bigger and bigger. It continued to target former officials. But that consolidation of power happens within an architectural design, which in a lot of ways is not very different than the Emirates' predecessor, the Islamic Republic. The broader shape of the government has not changed. The only change that has come is the removal of election as a source of legitimacy. Now, if you're thinking about democratic systems, that's that must be the most fundamental change. If you remove election from the political system, then you should have revamped everything. But for so many years before August 15th, election had lost their impact and influence and meaning in Afghanistan. They had been fraudulent. None of them were producing legitimacy or accountability to the people. So, for example, you had a parliament that was not able to keep the executive into account. You had a judiciary that was influenced heavily by the executive branch. You had provincial councils. You elected them. You spent a lot of resources on that election, but those provincial councils had no authority. And a lot of times, even people use these elections to get rich. For example, you would spend a lot of money in a parliamentary election, either to seduce people to vote for you or even to buy votes through more official channels and for example, co-opt members of the election commission. And then when you came to the parliament, you would use your authority to influence decision makers in the executive branch to give you contracts, for example, to a particular company that you owned or one of your relatives owned. And that's how you used the official system to enrich yourselves. On the actual democratic side of things, it really had no effect, either in terms of ensuring that people would keep their officials accountable or that there was a meaningful democratic practice. The other aspect of that is if you follow the development of the public space and the civic space in Afghanistan, Afghanistan has always been said to have one of the freest and most vibrant civil society and media spaces in the region, at least for most of the past 2 decades. But that space was not necessarily the byproduct of a very meticulous institutional design. It was not because we had so many checks on power and we ensured in our constitution and other legal structures that an open space would proliferate. It was because of the personal commitments of those people who controlled the power. During that time, President Karzai was in power. He was, in a lot of ways, ruled as a tribal leader. Consensus was very important for him. He wanted to keep everybody happy. You had a more open space. People criticized him in front of himself. People criticized him on media, and he tolerated all of that. And in 2014, you have a shift in administration, and Ashraf Ghani comes to power, and he is a much, much lesser tolerant person. His inner circle or a group of intolerant people who do not like to be criticized. So you see that the space is shrinking. There are a lot of criticism, but those criticisms are not getting anywhere. Those, for example, who talk about corruption or about misuse of authority, they are labeled as either unpatriotic, or some of them are even labeled as people who, at a very critical time in the country's history, might be empowering the country's enemies and the insurgency. So there are even incidents and cases where the government goes so far as to use its security and intelligence organizations to intimidate critics and journalists and all of that. And nobody is able to do anything. A huge example of that is the protest that happens in 2015 and 16, particularly in 2016, the Enlightenment movement, the Junvish Roshnayi, which is hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to demand a change in the direction of a huge infrastructure investment. The government refuses to listen to those voices. A bomb goes off. 86 people are killed, more than 400 people are injured. And despite despite that huge casualty, the government still unmoved by the protest. After that, the situation even gets worse. You have examples of government forces shooting at demonstrators. But the people are not able to do anything because there's no meaningful leverage. Even if you do not like your government, you wouldn't be able to do much about it. Another aspect of that is the presidential elections. We had one of the most contentious presidential elections in the region. And part of that was because everybody understood that if you did not control that one single seat at the top of the political system, namely the president, it wouldn't matter. And you saw that very vividly in 2014 when the National Unity Government was formed. You divided power half and half between the president and the CEO, but the CEO lost his influence in the cabinet very soon because the president had constitutional authority. In 2019, for example, you had the entire peace portfolio given to somebody else other than the president, but still the president remained the most influential decision maker in the peace structure. So that was how this the structure that we had in the country was marginalizing people from democratic practices and processes, and how it was undermining the local abilities and capacities of people to generate value in economic sense, to build resilience against shocks, environmental, economic shocks, but also to build resilience against political shocks. Either that was risks of authoritarianism from those people in power, or it was much bigger political shocks like the events that happened on August 15th. And that's why after August 15th, everybody felt so helpless. So I think I would stop at that, and I hope we come back to explore some of these issues in the question and answer that will follow.
Thank you so much. I think that summed up your paper properly. It's time for question and answer. I think we can take a few questions from the audience, but before that, let me ask you a question. You, I think, brilliantly highlight the politics of aid also and its impact on local resilience. And they say you mentioned that as foreign funding flowed to unprecedented level, it eroded local resilience. Local power holders and economic tycoons survived only because they maintained strong ties with those who control these sources of revenues. Let me ask this question about the current affairs. Currently, Taliban receive $40 million packages through United Nations. There is less about how these resources are distributed. And there's also less accountability to what extent it will reach the ones who are in need of it as a humanitarian aid. How do you see Taliban using the previous dysfunctional centralized system in order to misuse these resources? And to what extent the current aid may do the same thing that it has done in the previous government? I mean, eroding local resilience, but on the other hand, empowering those who are somehow surviving through patronage or local power holders who are misusing these resources.
So that's a very, very important issue right now that the international community is grappling with. And I think one of the reasons that we are grappling with that issue is because we still have not come to a point where we rethink the very fundamental frameworks within which we understand the politics of aid in these countries, and we want to, for example, do it differently. For years, you sent money to these projects without necessarily asking the question of, does it build capacity for sustainable value generations in the long term, or does it only feed people for today or the next day? And the aid right now is doing exactly just that. The humanitarian and economic crisis that we have is fundamentally a political crisis. We have a humanitarian crisis because there are people in power who have disrupted the economic market. There's a humanitarian crisis because the very unique character of the regime in power has disconnected the entire economic market of the country from the rest of the world. You cannot do international transactions, for example. You cannot print money. You cannot get loans from international organizations and all of that. So the aid that's going right now, at the beginning, everybody wanted to frame it as a purely humanitarian catastrophe, that we have to just feed people. We have to make sure that people are not dying of hunger. And there was a lot of conversation, and a lot of us raised the concern that you have to see bigger than that. Now, people are realizing that a little bit, and they're acknowledging that you can do more. But they're still continuing to follow the old model that they used to do. If you see the sort of the mechanisms that are newly put in place by the United Nations and other organizations in terms of regenerating economic value or reinvigorating the economic market, all of them are focusing on how to help businesses produce a little bit by giving them grants as if they are nonprofit organizations. But nobody is focusing on what happens if a business actually gets to a position where it produces. Where is the economic market for that business? And when it comes to accountability of these resources that were spent for the past year, I think the hands of the international community, the way it's working right now, it's operating right now, is very tight to control what the regime would be doing to that. I think it empowers the regime in two ways. One is that we see a lot and hear a lot of reports from the ground that the regime is using the aid money to pay its own soldiers, that it uses the aid distribution for political reasons. For example, the areas that are more friendly or thought to be more friendly or more supportive of anti-Taliban forces or the resistance forces, for example, are not receiving as much aid. And there's widespread reports from parts of the country, mainly populated by Hazaras, that their access to humanitarian aid has been limited by the regime. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of this is that the regime also raises its own revenues. It receives, for example, custom payments at various borders across the country, and many reports show that in most of these custom checkpoints, the revenue has increased. But the regime is not providing any services with that revenue. Most of the money that either you pay the teachers or you pay the health workers or you supply hospitals, for example, or you distribute humanitarian aid, that money comes from the international money that goes into the country, either through humanitarian organizations or through these 40 million packages that go daily inside the country. So the regime keeps its own money and uses that only to solidify its base of power, only to strengthen its hold on power and to make sure its own sustainability, rather than providing any meaningful service in terms of governance or public service delivery.
Thank you. I think we can go now to the audience. May I kindly ask you that I think you can turn on your video and unmute yourself and ask your question if you have any. We can also use the function of raising hand available here in Zoom. Anyway, so I think use this opportunity to ask another question. This would be with respect to prospect of the decentralization. So of course you do not propose right away a roadmap on how to decentralize. And at the current juncture, given the Taliban capture of state, there's no prospect for decentralization. Of course, what we need is a political roadmap for a settlement at first stage. Anyway, but I would like to hear your opinion about those who raise certain concerns about risks of decentralization. That may include lack of capacity at the local level, unbalanced economic resources, or also some may pose this as a risk of division of the country. How would you counter or argue for those who are raising these logics with respect to decentralization?
Well, I think before we go to that, I think state building efforts in Afghanistan have usually throughout different episodes of history followed at least three objectives, or try to pursue three objectives. The first and foremost one is stability, to make sure that they keep this country together, and that European definition of monopolizing the use of force. The other objective has been to create a national identity where everybody sees himself or herself in that identity as a collective. And the third one, which has been much more prominent after 2001, is to strengthen democratic principles and democratic institutions. And all of them have been, my thinking is that all of those objectives would be served at best if you have a decentralized political structure. It allows people public participation across the country in a much more meaningful way. It makes the country much more stable, because the root cause of the conflict is the division of political power. The conflict that you see in Afghanistan is mainly an ethnic conflict among different communities who cannot agree on how to divide power. And it's very ironic that in 2003 and 4, or even 2001, when the Bonn Conference is held, and after that, the constitutional process, in order to solve that disagreement that led to the civil war, we proposed the root cause of the problem as a solution, which is another centralized system that deprives so many groups of equal access and opportunity to political power. I think that a lot of the issues that the critics of decentralization suggest as obstacles or as reasons that will incentivize us not to decentralize, or actually the reasons for decentralization. Decentralization is not a factor that would divide the country. It's something that would bring the country. And examples of that is so many across the world. The United States is one of those countries that has a very decentralized federal structure. And the reason it has a federal structure is because nobody at the time was willing to give their own power to a central government fully. So they had to maintain some aspects of that power and identity. There are even states like Texas, for example, that has a very unique understanding with the central government in terms of its own level of autonomy. Indonesia is one of the countries that in the 1990s and late 1990s, under the Suharto regime, a lot of people were entertaining ideas of suppression from what was Indonesia back then. Decentralization helped the country maintain its sort of territorial integrity, what they would call. Ethiopia is another country where a lot of ethnic communities could not agree on the shape and details of the central government, and it decentralized heavily in order to keep everybody together, for example. Economic resources is another issue that has often been used as a reason against decentralization, that it's a poor country, that our revenues come only from few border points, either that's Herat or Balkh or Nangarhar or Kandahar, and then the rest of the country. So that the conventional rhetorical question that you would face is that, what about Bamyan, which doesn't have a lot of things? There are two things or three issues I think to mention here. One is that if you establish some level of stability, economic revenues does not have to come predominantly from the border points. It should not come predominantly from border points. The only reason all of our economic revenue, or most of it, comes from customs is because we have not been successful enough in building foundations and infrastructure for taxation, for example. That domestic revenue generation is very important. The other aspect of that is that economic production in a lot of decentralized countries is designed in a way where every part of the country contribute to an economic endeavor, to an economic activity. If you're producing a car, for example, in Kabul, all of that car from A to Z is not produced in Kabul. The tire comes from another province. The assembly is done somewhere else. The seats is produced somewhere else, so that everybody else contributes in that chain of economic activity and everybody gets something out of it. In the United States, for example, Midwest America doesn't have much, but it still is a heavily decentralized system, and they are able to raise revenues. Dime, the small coin that you have in America, if you see the numbers, more than 90% of the dime that's produced is thrown away. It's wasted. Nobody uses the dime. The reason it's produced is because one of the states has a particular type of metal that's used for dime production. So in order to keep that resource generation for that province, the central government, the Federal Reserve produces dime, even if it's not used. Those are, for example, the mechanisms. The other argument that's made is that the consequence of decentralization on stability, on dividing the country, and all of that is that none of the countries that you see that are decentralized have decentralized in its very shiny moments in history. If everything is perfectly fine, if a centralized system is fully functional and effective, there's no reason to decentralize. Decentralization comes as a solution at a time of crisis. Every country has decentralized at a time that they have been struggling with these issues. So I think this argument that it's not the time, that we have to wait, that we do not have the capacity and the resources, I think it's invalid because it's a very critical time we should decentralize, because it's a solution. It's not a fancy idea to just entertain when we have everything else figured out.
Thank you. I think we have a question from our friend Tabish Frokh. Frokh Saib, you can unmute and also, can you hear us? Well, I think he cannot hear us. So if there's no other question, again, I think I will have this opportunity to ask my third question. Yes, Jennifer, Professor Matazashvili.
Oh, you should call me Jen. And I just want to thank you, Omar, for organizing this. It's amazing just to have these conversations right now, and just really grateful to you for bringing us all together. So, Said, I just have a question. It's sort of amazing to me, as someone who is sort of shouting about decentralization for 15 years, a lot of people have sort of come to this as a potential solution to this dynamic. And I often wonder, so I'll make it just a brief statement, whether the issue wasn't decentralization so much as it was like giving the people the right to vote for anything at the subnational level. I think, as you so eloquently stated, all the competition for power was in Kabul. Even all civil society was in Kabul, because that's where you could lobby for change. There was no lobbying for, you could lobby for change at the subnational level, but it was all informal. Right, it was through brokering, and then that became corruption. But because people had no way of having any kind of voice at the subnational level. But as we think about the situation today, the way that the Taliban is governing, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, your opinion about whether you see them, they've inherited this very centralized state. They seem to like it. Do you see them changing their strategy towards governance at all? They want to stay in power, right? So if we think about a government that's behaving rationally and trying to learn the mistakes of the previous regimes, they would probably understand that they have to to give some power away, but yet the paradox is that very few leaders, once they're in power, want to give any power away. And they're very busy consolidating. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about where you see the trajectory of governance going right now. And thank you for your excellent presentation.
Thanks so much, Jen. Good to see you. I think the Taliban, when they were in insurgency, they had a very interesting division of labor, I would say. The ideological and main sort of fundamental decision-making and thinking was concentrated in these leadership councils being mainly based in Pakistan. But when it came to operationalization, they had a very decentralized insurgency. They allowed their commanders across the country to basically conduct the insurgency in whatever way they saw fit. But they were not allowed to grapple with fundamental sort of ideological questions. Those had to be dealt with in Pakistan. Now that they are in the government, I think there's a clash between those divisions of labor, because you have to bring both of them under one umbrella. And that's why after last August, everybody thought that, for example, Sirajuddin Haqqani, the Minister of Interior, was the most powerful person, because he led the most brutal and effective and efficient wing of the military insurgency. Or, for example, the Minister of Defense was powerful. And continuously, people realized that when it comes to issues of girls' education, schools, and all of, or the diversity of the government for that matter, these people were not as influential as we thought they were, because these are fundamental questions that another group of people that we do not have access to or do not have relationship with are talking and discussing and deciding over. My understanding is that the Taliban have a very limited perception of government. And I think we see that in the little documents that they've put out so far. We see that in the very sort of early ideology and the political reasoning off of which they came to existence in the mid-1990s, and we see that in their insurgency. They define governance as a provision of two basic and fundamental services: justice and security. They're going to keep everybody safe, and if somebody commits a crime, they're going to punish that. That's how it has been last time they were in power. That's how it has been when they were running an insurgency, and that's how it is right now. The provision of public services, I still am convinced that the provision of public services and governance in the sort of full-fledged way that we understand it is not a concern for the Taliban. Economic well-being, education, these are not concerns for the Taliban. And I think those ideological figures at the very top tier of Taliban leadership understand that that limited way of governing is also something that would serve them and that would continue and help their sustainability. The more they open up, the more they provide services, I think the more vulnerable they become. It's almost something very closely related to how they're seeing the outside world. People have constantly been saying that the Taliban crave international recognition, and that's the only leverage that we have. My understanding is that the Taliban do not want international recognition. A Taliban connected to the rest of the world will be a Taliban open to so many vulnerabilities to be leveraged against them. The Taliban know that an isolated group is a group that can hardly be influenced in any way. Right now, they are ripping everything from their engagement with the rest of the world. They receive a lot of money in their scale of governance. Almost $2.5 billion since last August is a lot of money that they have received in many forms and shapes. Until last month, they were allowed and able to travel. They have their international engagement with the region and other countries, but they do not have any responsibility to the international system. And there's even a theoretical understanding of this, which is groups like the Taliban receive their part of their legitimacy from standing against the international system. They've been kept saying that they're fighting against the American supremacy and the American imperialism. It's almost antithetical to me that they would crave so much for a recognition by a world order that's very American centric and American influenced, I would say. And I think when it comes to governance inside Afghanistan, again, I don't think they will move out towards more sort of expanded versions of governance where they would actually care about education, about the provision of public services, and definitely not so far as the international community through various mechanisms offer them helping hands. Either that's supplying the hospitals or paying the doctors or paying the teachers or anything else, because they do not even feel the pressure from the community to provide the services.
It's not just pressure, I suppose. The question I asked about humanitarian aid and aid in general given to the Taliban, I think that has helped the Taliban regime to move away from its core responsibility as an authority now. For instance, $2.5 billion of Afghanistan reserve, which will now go to a Swiss account, is allocated for payment of electricity. So now if Taliban generate revenue from at least 5 to 6 different streams, and international community is continuing to pay for electricity, let's say for many other services, of course, Taliban will enjoy their own revenues the way that they want. Anyway, so now let's move to Tabish Froh. If you can hear us, hi.
Yes, do you hear me, Dr. Saber?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello to everyone. Hello to Saeed. Thank you very much for the very fascinating presentation. Maybe I start with 2 comments, 1 question, very briefly. I mean, on the issue of 40 million weekly cash delivery to the Taliban, yes, it's a very dangerous thing, but honestly, sometimes looking at the global scope of events, I mean, imagine what if Boko Haram gets control of a part of Nigeria and then the UN and the rest of the world sends cash to them, or Al-Shabaab in Sudan, or the rest of the international jihadists with capacity to overthrow established states and order, and then become the de facto partner of the world in a way that Saeed very cleverly explained, right? You don't need recognition internationally, but you still need money, plus other internal revenues that you collect, and then consolidate any form of dictatorial rule, including theocratic regimes, authoritarian regimes, with no respect to human rights or to any fundamental rights of citizens, right? What precedents we're putting for the world, right? If you're a terrorist, if you're part of a terrorist network anywhere in the world, then you're not afraid of the whole legal, political sanction systems of international order. This is a very dangerous pattern I see. My comments, which Saeed mentioned on election, in 2010, 2011, I was slowly becoming part of the executive leadership at the Election Commission of Afghanistan, and I saw very firsthand how centralized system in the hands of the president failed Afghanistan's democratic experiment. For example, when the whole disputes over Ghazni validation of the results, final results came, President Karzai was furious because out of the 11 seats, all of them were local Hazaras who competed in elections and who were the winners of the elections. So top 17 winner of all the seats in Ghazni were Hazara candidates. I remember attending in one of the sessions with the chairperson of the Election Commission with a number of other international colleagues of ours. With the SRG at the time, he was Stefan de Mistura, this Italian guy, very well articulated, skilled negotiator. He told us that, look, President Karzai wants a few Pashtuns to be part of Ghazni's final results. And there is no way he certifies the ultimate results without these changes. What I'm trying to say that centralization, not just in political sphere and economic and state building and institution building, it literally failed Afghanistan's democratic experiment from top to down. Karzai was responsible for this. Ghani was responsible for this. Their political allies, including their vice president, the constituencies of non-Pashtuns that they were dealing with, they were all responsible for this failure. And no one paid attention. International community understood at the time, and they even understand now what wrongs we are doing, but still no one cares. So this is two comments. My question to Saeed is on the question of state formation, national identity, democratic commitments, the whole project, right? All of these pillars have somehow failed, and facing and understanding the Taliban, we know that none of these will result into a broad-based, inclusive dialogue between Afghanistan citizens over anything. The whole idea of Afghaniyat or Afghanish and Islamiyat, which the Taliban's two theoretical political pillars of understanding and system presents, is somehow challenged by the rest of the country. Afghaniyat or Afghanish or the Talibani form of politics means that it's dominated by a single ethnic group with no respect for inclusivity, with no respect for human rights, and with no inclination towards opening up the political space for the rest of the country. So you are facing a dead end. You either deal with it, stay silent, accept the reality as some preaches in the international community, and let the Taliban to moderate from within and throughout, for example, engagement in the next 10, 20 years. Or you have to find another solution, which is not giving back, or which is not returning to an established order designed for the dominance of Afghaniyat and for this Islamic character of the Taliban, which will prevail as they consolidate. So I will be very interested to listen to Saeed, what we do, what we the people do. I'm not very hopeful of international engagement, because the way I see it, it's not going to be very productive, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Tavish. I think, first of all, I don't think it's an international issue. I don't think it's the primary concern of the international community, and I don't think it should not be. It's, at the end of the day, it's something that the people of Afghanistan have to work on. If we do not want a country governed and ruled by the Taliban, then that's something that we have to deal with, and we have to come up with a solution. My understanding is that the Taliban will never sit on a table of negotiation with anybody else that would give other people meaningful opportunities and access to power and resources. In another word, the Taliban will never agree to share their monopoly of power with anybody else. And what that means in the long term is that the end of the Taliban, either that comes in 6 months or 6 years or 60 years, is going to come with the collapse of the regime, not in a way that they would co-opt others through negotiations where everybody else will become part of the system, and the system will gradually open up to more diversity. I think the system will, at the end of the day, collapse. That's one of the aspects of this centralized system. It is very rigid, that against pressure from outside, it never bends. It always resists, and at the end of it, when it does not have enough power and resources to resist, it cracks and breaks. And I think the Taliban will only have to do that. What's important is to have clarity about what should an Afghanistan after the Taliban look like. In 2001 and 2 and 3, when we were done with the Taliban, we had no idea what we wanted next. What unified everybody else was a common enemy in the Taliban. And the minute that common enemy was removed from power and almost stopped existing, nobody had an idea of what should come next. If you follow, for example, the conversations that happened around the constitutional process in 2003, you would understand how unprepared everybody was for that. So I think that should not happen. I would strongly advise against either banking so much on international engagement or even welcoming so much of international engagement. This has to be, at the end of the day, a conversation among those whose lives on the line and whose futures are on the line in Afghanistan. They have to come up with solutions that would ensure a prosperous and equitable country. So I think a lot of thinking in terms of what should come next after the Taliban is very important. And because we have sort of a habit of, if you ask people for solution, their easy answer would be, give the power to me and I'm going to do something about it. I think we should start thinking now about the future, and we should acknowledge that it's not anything easy, straightforward, or short term. It takes a lot of efforts. We have to have clarity about so many aspects of our public life and political institutions if we want to break this cycle of violence and fragility.
Thank you. And I think there is no other hands raised so far, but if I can ask something related to what you mentioned earlier, just now, as about how can we think about shaping institutions in a different way, which may entail, of course, a decentralized manner. So decentralization is not just a political question. It also involves administrative kind of decentralization and financial one. Can you give us maybe an overview or a broader picture of how a decentralized Afghanistan, if in case there would be any, should be designed, both in terms of finance and in terms of administration, but also political legitimacy?
Thank you very much. That's a question that I should be a little bit ready to answer 5 years from now. But my thinking about this is very preliminary, to be honest. And the more I think about this and the more I work on this topic, the more I realize how complicated this is. It's very hard to say beforehand specific sort of prescriptions in terms of how the fiscal aspect of this should look like, how the financial aspect of this should look like, how the administrative and the political aspect of this should look like. But there are at least some of the issues that other experiences from other parts of the world show, and I think we need to pay attention. One is that when it comes to legitimacy, political legitimacy, an area, a space that a lot of these come to play in a very sort of meaningful and fundamental way, and we have not paid attention to, is elections. We have designed very sort of simplified election systems that are not responsive to the political demands of the people, that are not responsive to the complicated sort of socio-political diversity of the country, that's not responsive to how much resources we have in terms of running the elections. Electoral system design, I'm realizing more and more every day, is the most important aspect of this, both in terms of what levels of the system you have elections for, but also how you design these elections in a way that would, from the one hand, promote, for example, a program-based political party development. From another hand, make sure that you connect the elected officials to a particular geography so that people can keep them accountable. How do you make sure that national big political parties do not eat up smaller political parties at the local level? So that's a very, very important one. Another one in terms of the fiscal aspect of this and the administrative aspect of this is that there's extensive research showing that people will have much higher incentive to pay taxes, to contribute to public resource mobilization if they have a control over those resources. One of the issues that we always have difficulty in terms of raising taxes in Afghanistan is because you pay tax, but you don't know what's going to happen to your money. You pay tax in Badakhshan or Farah or Zabul, and that money comes to Kabul, and after that, you have no information about it, where it's going to be spent, how it's going to be allocated, and what's going to be the direct impact of that on your life next year and the year after that. So, for example, decentralization of resource mobilization and resource allocation, the first impact it's going to have is it's going to increase the amount of resources that would be able to accumulate and to mobilize at the domestic level. So I think that's very important. The third one issue is that for a decentralized system, you also need very credible and strong arbitrators of conflict. Either that's conflict between different, for example, local governments or different state governments, or that's between the national or the federal government and the state and local governments. So how you design a judiciary, first of all, should that arbitrator be an official structure like the judiciary, or you design a separate system, or you keep it informal through mutual negotiations and all of that? I think that's a very big question. Some countries have a separate constitutional court that attends to these issues. Some countries have morphed that constitutional court into the Supreme Court. Some countries, for example, have mechanisms at the local level where different governments negotiate with each other. How much authority you give to the central government in terms of its foreign engagement, or the authorities and responsibilities that fall at the center, how much they should cater to the concerns and needs of the local governments is something very important. That when we're thinking about arbitration of conflict comes to play. For example, if the central government is signing a trade agreement with a foreign country, and that trade agreement is going to have huge implications only for one particular part of the country, either positively or negatively, should it be required to get the approval of that country is something, for example, very important.
We have two questions now in the chat bar. Let me flag them for you. First question is from Maiwan Rahyat. He states that the current realities in the country don't represent real opportunities for meaningful engagement with the regime. It will take some time until we get to the point where dynamics evolve and allow for practical work in the area. The question is, do you see a role for civil society and local community structures, including ethnic and religious, to play a role in providing essential services, and thereby demonstrating examples of how a decentralized structure could better serve the country? Would you like to take this? And then I can go to the second question. Probably I may ask you to briefly address this because we're running now over 1 hour.
I agree with Maiwan that there's no space for a lot of meaningful engagement with the regime, and I think that the Taliban in many ways also poses us with some sort of a theoretical deadlock of a group like the Taliban at a time like we're living right now. Has never been in power in other parts of the world. It's extremely difficult to borrow from other experiences, and it limits every aspect of life. So to think of ways to still work with civil society on the ground, for example, is very hard. I would say it requires a huge degree of creativity and innovation, and that's what we need right now. I think what is important is one of the sort of the streams through which I'm thinking about this is, how can you use the humanitarian aid as a mechanism for maintaining some basic levels of public engagement and mobilization, so that the democratic capacity that you had built over the years is not fully lost and wasted after 2 decades of investment. How can you design local mechanisms of accountability for humanitarian aid that from the one hand can ensure the effectiveness of aid and the efficiency of its disbursement, but from the other hand can make sure that you maintain some levels of institutional capacity where people can get together and mobilize over issues and ideas that are not necessarily very threatening to the regime. I think that's very important. And then you can also work around issues of local economic value generation that can give people some space to not worry about the meal that they're gonna have to eat the next day, and only then you can think of how you empower civil society in those areas. I think the economic empowerment at the local level in a meaningful way, not only by giving them grants to businesses, but also by connecting them to a meaningful market in a sustainable way is one area. And then to use and utilize the humanitarian aid and growingly now the economic aid that's going into the country as a platform for public mobilization and engagement is something else that I think can be explored.
Okay, so the last question I think comes from Andrew Watkins of USIP. So he says, I agree that the discourse on future of Afghan system should be Afghan-led and perhaps quite exclusive, shutting out foreign Western government voices, which comes with agendas. Do you have any thought on what the gap between daily needs, priorities, and perspectives of local community leaders who are stuck living under the Taliban? One can imagine a growing gap, if not in values, then at least lived experiences, and wonders how those differences will shape a conversation that needs to bridge diaspora and local voices. So if I have posed question properly to you, so how can there is a gap between those of us here and the others who are, facing the reality on the ground?
I think that's a very important but also inevitable gap that we have no escape from. But at the same time, my understanding of this is that people in various spaces that they're operating, I think their work are complementary to each other. If the diaspora is doing some segments of the work, either that's producing ideas about the future of Afghanistan, or either that is to mobilize politically or intellectually against the Taliban, that does not necessarily come as a replacement or as something prioritized over what other people might be doing inside the country. I think as an issue of principle, people who are living under the Taliban, people who are on the ground should come first in any conversation about the future, even if we're not in a position, sort of logistically feasible position to engage them every day. At least any sort of thinking of the future of Afghanistan should be happening with the acknowledgement that at the end of the day, the people who are on the ground will have the first and most important say in how the future should be shaped. I think that the women who are on the streets are, for example, the people who are and will continue to shape this conversation, even if they're not part of much more sophisticated intellectual and political conversations that might happen out of Afghanistan. Even people who are doing the military resistance, we like it or not, they have made a personal choice, they will be part of that conversation about the future of Afghanistan. So I think everybody's work comes complementary to each other rather than one being prioritized over the other or one being a replacement for that.
And probably the last question, which comes from Palwasha. We understand that the centralized system has been a status quo for a good over a century. Then there is an interest of one or two individuals at the periphery to keep serving the center to hold their grounds. In your view, what needs to be done now until D-Day to make sure that we are ready and don't miss the opportunity when it comes? And I would like to hear your view on people's psyche and their understanding of decentralization.
I think there is a lot of sort of political narrative produced in favor of centralization in terms of how people have gotten used to this centralization of power over the centuries and how it's going to be difficult to change. I had a conversation this morning with a group of people who were saying, look, even if you decentralize and have meaningful local elections, it's going to be hard to mobilize people to vote in those elections because they're not used to that. It's not a country politically as sophisticated as you would require it to be for a decentralized system. But I think those are only our assumptions about this. One of the reasons that we have had difficulty having sustainable periods of stability is because people have never gotten used to centralization of power and decision-making in Kabul. It's a country that has historically been very decentralized, and its geography is not helpful for centralization of power. You have a very diverse country with each community with very specific sociocultural traits who live across the country, and then you have a very hard geography that's almost impossible to equally and efficiently and effectively reach from one location, be that Kabul or anywhere else. So that's why it has been difficult even for central governments to fully centralize it in ways that would allow it to perpetuate a narrative to which everybody buy into. So I think that the psyche of the people is more conducive to decentralization rather than centralization.
Thank you, Saeed. I think we are coming to the end of this session, but I'm sure there are many more points to discuss, and just 1 hour is not enough for all of the issues to be covered. But I'm really thankful to all our audience, those who posed the question, and particularly to you, Saeed, for presenting an excellent talk on dysfunctional centralized system in Afghanistan. But we at the Center for Governance and Markets would like to be engaged with all of you in future, but stay tuned for more panels giving opportunity for voices from Afghanistan. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, Mark.